And then Cunningham gets into the face of DiJonai Carrington.
We have grown-ass men and women out here doing whatever they can to try to make sure that does not happen.
Something just happened in the WNBA that turned one hard foul into a much bigger controversy, and now the spotlight is falling on DiJonai Carrington, Sophie Cunningham, Caitlin Clark, and even LeBron James. During a heated matchup, Cunningham was racing toward the basket when Carrington came from behind and made heavy contact with her near the head and neck area. The play was reviewed and ultimately resulted in a flagrant 2 ejection. But the controversy didn't end when Carrington left the court. A social media post that appeared shortly afterward pushed the situation into an entirely different conversation about race, sports, and accountability. And that's where things get interesting.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a hard foul. I don't think that DiJonai intentionally came out to get her across the neck like she did, but it did happen, and I thought it was the right call. But, you know, one of the things about Nay is that she's going to play her butt off, man. She's going to compete. Nobody's going to go walking in for a layup. And so I don't oppose the hard foul. But I also don't think that she intentionally went for the neck.
Because this isn't simply about one foul anymore. There is a history involving Caitlin Clark, previous confrontations, growing criticism of the WNBA's physical style of play, and now questions about whether the league is doing enough to protect its players. And with LeBron James already having a public connection to Clark, his name is now being pulled into the conversation too. So what really happened, and why has this incident exploded far beyond the basketball court?
DiJonai Carrington last night almost took off Sophie Cunningham's head, gets ejected from the game, rightfully so, runs to the locker room, gets on Threads, and types out white privilege. Which is crazy, especially coming from a gal that's literally wearing a bleach blonde wig. Now, let's talk about black privilege for a second. Doing something completely wrong and unethical, and instead of taking responsibility, pulls out the race card and acts like a victim. Yeah, that's what we just witnessed here. The sheer lack of accountability on DiJonai's end, that was so intentional. Look at DiJonai staring at Sophie's head the whole time, and look at her reaction after. That's anger. A normal reaction would be to ask if Sophie was okay or immediately apologize. But instead she shoves her. The audacity to go and cry wolf and pull out the fake victim card and scream white privilege. All the while making Sophie Cunningham bleed as a result to her actions. People are tired of everything being blamed on race. I wouldn't be surprised if DiJonai did this in response to Sophie Cunningham coming out vocally in response to protecting women in women's sports. This was not white privilege. Under DiJonai's definition of white privilege, here's some more white privilege. Getting ejected from the game was called consequences to actions. And DiJonai should be thankful that an ejection is all that happened, because she ought to be suspended from the entire league.
For a moment, it looked like a routine fast break. Sophie Cunningham had a clear path toward the basket, and the Indiana Fever were looking to turn another defensive possession into easy points. Cunningham gathered the ball, took off toward the rim, and appeared ready to finish the play. Then DiJonai Carrington came charging from behind. Carrington reached toward Cunningham as she went up, but instead of making clean contact with the basketball, her arm came across Cunningham's upper body and head area. Cunningham went down hard. And suddenly, the entire atmosphere changed. What happened next wasn't just another physical moment in a competitive WNBA game. It became the spark for a much larger debate about physical play, player safety, social media, race, and the growing tension surrounding the Indiana Fever.
So a black girl clotheslines a white girl on the basketball court, was ejected from the game, and then immediately tweets out white privilege. The claim is so outlandish, I don't even know how to rebut it or what commentary to provide, because in what world does it make sense, right? Then you have Sports Illustrated with this headline after the game. Let me just remind you what Sophie Cunningham said. Actually, I'll just put it right here. This is what Sophie Cunningham said regarding protecting women's sports. That is it. Nothing more, nothing less. So I guess this is the price of standing for women and for girls. And what, we all just have to accept it as karma? No, this is assault far beyond what is normal on a basketball court. And who would be surprised if I told you that DiJonai Carrington, the woman who did that to Sophie, is the same woman who did this to Caitlin Clark? One more time, just in slow-mo. Oh yeah, that pesky white privilege. Final thoughts. The WNBA is a joke. Sophie Cunningham is an icon, and black people like DiJonai Carrington can, in fact, be racist.
Officials reviewed the play and upgraded the foul to a flagrant 2, sending Carrington out of the game. That decision immediately became one of the biggest talking points of the night. But there was another moment that made the controversy explode. After leaving the game, Carrington posted the words, "white privilege," on social media. That changed the conversation completely.
Take a walk with me, take a walk with me, take a walk with me. There is craziness going on in the WNBA. DiJonai Carrington tweeted out white privilege from the locker room of a game that she was playing in. Get this. She fouled Sophie Cunningham hard. Sophie Cunningham, obviously white person, fouled her hard. Flagrant 2, gets ejected, goes to the locker room and tweets out white privilege in the middle of the game. Now here's the kicker to me. A flagrant 2 has to be contact that can lead to an injury that looks excessive. DiJonai, it was about as excessive as possible. If there was any evidence of there being white privilege, this was not it.
Instead of people debating only whether the foul was excessive, fans suddenly found themselves arguing over what Carrington's message meant, why she posted it, and whether the incident had anything to do with race in the first place. And Cunningham's reaction made the contrast even more interesting. Rather than turning the situation into an extended confrontation, Cunningham essentially dismissed the drama and indicated that whatever Carrington had against her, she could deal with it. That response became important because Cunningham had already been at the center of intense discussions away from the basketball court. She had publicly spoken about women's sports and the protection of female athletes, a subject that has become extremely divisive. Her comments had attracted criticism, support, boos, online arguments, and plenty of attention. So when this physical confrontation happened, many people immediately connected the two events. Was this simply an aggressive basketball play? Was it frustration boiling over during a competitive game? Or did the larger controversy surrounding Cunningham play a role in what happened? Those are very different questions. And that's exactly why this story became so much bigger than a flagrant foul. Because the Indiana Fever have already spent an enormous amount of time at the center of the WNBA conversation. And much of that attention comes back to one name: Caitlin Clark. Clark has experienced an unusually intense level of physical attention since entering the league. Some plays have been ordinary basketball contact. Others have sparked serious debate among fans, analysts, former players, and media personalities. Carrington herself has previously been involved in controversial moments involving Clark. That history matters because fans don't watch every incident in isolation anymore. When a new hard foul happens to a Fever player, people immediately remember the previous incidents. They remember the arguments. They remember the complaints. They remember the debates about whether the league allows too much physicality. And they remember how quickly every Fever game can become a national story. That's what happened here. The foul against Cunningham wasn't simply viewed as one isolated basketball moment. For many viewers, it became another chapter in a much longer argument about how the WNBA handles physical play involving its most recognizable players. And this is where the league faces a difficult problem. Basketball is a physical sport. Defenders are supposed to challenge shots. Players are allowed to compete aggressively. A hard foul isn't automatically malicious. But there is a line. And when contact happens around the head or neck, the consequences can become much more serious. That's why the flagrant 2 decision mattered. The officials weren't simply deciding whether Carrington made contact. They had to determine whether the nature of that contact crossed the threshold for an ejection. Once that happened, the debate moved beyond the court. Social media took over. Fans immediately divided into different camps. One side argued that Carrington's play was dangerous and deserved the ejection. Another side argued that the contact looked like an overly aggressive attempt to stop a layup rather than a deliberate attempt to injure Cunningham. And then there were people focused almost entirely on Carrington's social media post. The phrase, "white privilege," became the headline inside the headline. Suddenly, a basketball incident had become part of a much broader cultural argument. That's where things can get messy. Because there is a major difference between saying a foul was dangerous and claiming you know exactly what was happening inside another player's mind. Nobody watching a video can automatically know someone's intention. The arm comes down. The player falls. The officials make their decision. But proving what was inside the defender's head is much harder. That distinction is important because the debate surrounding this incident became increasingly emotional. Some commentators immediately described the foul as intentional. Others insisted it was simply a bad basketball decision. And both sides began using the moment to reinforce arguments they already had about the WNBA. Supporters of Cunningham saw another example of a Fever player being subjected to unnecessary physical treatment. Critics of Cunningham saw the controversy as another example of social media turning ordinary basketball conflict into a national political argument. Meanwhile, Carrington's post added fuel to both sides. And that's why this situation became impossible to ignore. But there was another person whose name started appearing in the conversation. LeBron James. LeBron has publicly shown support for Caitlin Clark, and that connection matters because Clark has become one of the most recognizable athletes in women's basketball. Whenever something happens around Clark or the Fever, the conversation can spread far beyond the WNBA itself. LeBron doesn't have to personally enter the argument for his name to become relevant. His relationship with Clark has already made him part of the wider conversation surrounding her career. And that creates a fascinating dynamic. Because if the controversy continues to grow, the question becomes whether major sports figures like LeBron will have anything to say about the treatment of Fever players. But there's an even bigger question. What does the WNBA do next? Because an ejection ends one game, it doesn't necessarily end the controversy. The league still has to determine whether additional discipline is appropriate. It has to consider the severity of the contact. It has to look at the circumstances surrounding the play. And it has to make sure that its decision is based on basketball rules rather than social media pressure. That's the part fans are waiting for. Not another argument. Not another viral clip. Not another endless battle between opposing fan bases. They want to know what the league believes the appropriate standard should be. Because if a player is allowed to compete aggressively, where exactly is the boundary? And if the league believes certain contact crosses that boundary, will that standard be applied consistently? Those questions matter much more than one viral post. And that's why the Cunningham-Carrington confrontation could become bigger than anyone expected. The game ended. The foul was called. Carrington was ejected. But the debate was only beginning. Because once Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, the Indiana Fever, social media, and LeBron James all become part of the same conversation, this stops being just another WNBA game. It becomes a story about the direction of the league itself. To understand why this incident created such a massive reaction, you have to look beyond Sophie Cunningham. Because the moment Carrington's foul became connected to the Indiana Fever, another name immediately entered the conversation. Caitlin Clark. Clark's arrival in the WNBA changed the league's spotlight almost overnight. Every game involving Indiana receives enormous attention, and every controversial play involving Clark or her teammates can become a national debate within minutes. But the attention hasn't always been positive. From hard defensive plays to questionable contact, Clark has been involved in several moments that generated arguments about how physical the WNBA should be. And one of the names that keeps coming back into those discussions is DiJonai Carrington. That history is important. Because when fans saw Carrington involved in another controversial physical play, this time against Cunningham, they didn't see it as an isolated incident. They remembered what happened before. They remembered the previous playoff confrontation involving Carrington and Clark. They remembered the discussions about contact around Clark's face. And they remembered the arguments that followed about whether the league was doing enough to protect its biggest stars. Now, it's important to make one distinction. A history of controversial plays does not automatically prove that every new incident was intentional. Basketball is unpredictable. Defenders reach. Players collide. Momentum can turn a normal defensive attempt into dangerous contact. But repeated controversy naturally creates questions. And that's exactly what happened here. Fans started asking whether the league has a consistent standard for physical play. Does it matter who the player is? Does it matter which team is involved? Or should every incident be judged independently? Those questions became even louder because the Fever have become one of the most watched teams in women's basketball. Indiana isn't simply another franchise anymore. With Clark leading the spotlight and players like Aaliyah Boston and Sophie Cunningham contributing to the team, every game has become an event. That creates pressure for everyone involved. The players feel it. The coaches feel it. The officials feel it. And the league certainly feels it. A controversial call that might have disappeared in another game can become national news when it happens during an Indiana Fever matchup. That's the reality of the Clark era. And it explains why this confrontation became so explosive. But then came another layer. The conversation surrounding Sophie Cunningham herself. Cunningham has been outspoken about issues involving women's sports, and those comments have made her a highly recognizable figure beyond basketball. Some fans support her. Others strongly disagree with her. That divide was already visible online before the Carrington incident. So when Cunningham was hit during the game and Carrington later posted about white privilege, the two conversations collided. Basketball fans were suddenly debating politics. Political commentators were debating basketball. And social media accounts were turning one play into an argument about race, gender, and the future of women's sports. At that point, the actual game almost became secondary. And that's one of the biggest problems with modern sports controversies. The original event can get buried beneath the reaction. Instead of asking, what exactly happened on the court? People immediately start asking, whose side are you on? That's when reasonable discussion becomes much harder. One side sees Cunningham as a victim of unnecessary physicality. The other side argues that the play should be judged strictly as basketball. Some believe Carrington's social media response changed the meaning of the incident. Others believe people are reading too much into a short social media statement. And somewhere in the middle is the actual question the league has to answer. Was the punishment appropriate? Carrington was ejected. But was that enough? Should there be additional discipline? Should the league look at previous incidents when determining punishment? Or should every foul receive its own independent evaluation? Those questions aren't easy. A league can't create rules based on fan outrage. At the same time, it can't ignore a growing perception that certain players are repeatedly involved in dangerous contact. That perception alone can become a problem. Because professional sports depend heavily on trust. Players need to trust that officials will protect them. Teams need to trust that discipline will be consistent. Fans need to trust that the competition is being managed fairly. And when that trust disappears, every controversial play becomes evidence for somebody's argument. That's exactly what happened with the Fever. The Cunningham incident became another piece of a much larger puzzle. Then there was the reaction from the crowd. Carrington's ejection became a spectacle of its own. Cunningham was seen reacting as Carrington left the court, and fans immediately turned that image into another viral moment. Instead of the game simply moving forward, the ejection became part of the entertainment. That tells you how emotionally charged this rivalry has become. The Indiana Fever don't need to manufacture controversy. The attention already exists. Clark's popularity guarantees it. And when another player becomes involved in a controversial incident against Indiana, the reaction can be enormous. That's why the Carrington situation isn't just about two players. It's about the environment surrounding the Fever. And this is where LeBron James becomes relevant again. LeBron has publicly supported Clark before. His interest in her career has been visible, and Clark has openly acknowledged his influence and support. So when another controversial incident involving a Fever player explodes across social media, people naturally wonder whether major sports figures will react. But there's a difference between being connected to the conversation and personally attacking another player. That distinction matters. The viral headline may suggest that LeBron destroyed Carrington. But the bigger story is actually more subtle. LeBron represents the growing mainstream attention surrounding Clark and the Fever. His involvement demonstrates just how far the conversation has moved beyond the WNBA's traditional audience. This isn't happening inside a small basketball bubble anymore. It's happening across mainstream sports media, social media, podcasts, television, and celebrity culture. And that creates enormous pressure on the WNBA. The league has benefited tremendously from the attention surrounding Clark. But with that attention comes a challenge. Every controversy becomes bigger. Every foul is replayed. Every social media post is analyzed. Every reaction is clipped. And every disagreement can become a national argument. That means the league has to be especially careful about consistency. If a dangerous foul happens, fans want a clear explanation. If a player is suspended, they want to understand why. If another similar incident happens later, they expect the same standard. That's how credibility is built. And that's why the next decision surrounding Carrington matters. Not because one suspension will suddenly solve every problem in the WNBA, but because it will send a message about what the league considers acceptable physical play. The situation also raises a larger question about player responsibility. Athletes have enormous freedom on social media. But with that freedom comes consequences. A short post written immediately after an emotional game can become a headline within seconds. Once something goes viral, it can no longer be treated as a private reaction. That is the reality Carrington now faces. The foul was one moment. The social media post became another. The previous Clark incidents became another. And the Fever's enormous fan base connected all of those moments together. Whether that connection is completely fair is another debate. But it's impossible to ignore. Because the WNBA is now operating under a microscope unlike anything it experienced several years ago. And Caitlin Clark is at the center of that microscope. Every opponent who guards her aggressively becomes part of the conversation. Every hard foul becomes a potential headline. Every post-game comment can become a viral clip. And every controversy can influence how millions of fans perceive the league. That is why this situation matters. Not because one player hit another. Not because one social media post went viral. But because the incident exposed the growing tension between competitive basketball and the enormous cultural conversation surrounding the WNBA. And if the league wants to keep this momentum going, it has to prove that the rules apply consistently, regardless of the team, the player, the fan base, or the controversy surrounding them. At this point, the controversy was no longer just about what happened between DiJonai Carrington and Sophie Cunningham. It was about what happens next. Because once a player is ejected for a flagrant 2 foul, the league has another decision to make. Does the story end with the ejection? Or does the WNBA believe the incident deserves additional consequences? That's the question fans were waiting to have answered. And the answer matters because professional sports leagues aren't judged only by the calls officials make during a game. They're also judged by what happens afterward. If the league believes a play crossed the line, additional discipline can reinforce that standard. If the league decides the ejection was sufficient, it can send a completely different message. Either way, the decision will be watched closely. And the pressure is even greater because of the history surrounding the Indiana Fever. The Fever have spent much of the season at the center of conversations about physical defense. Caitlin Clark has experienced plenty of attention from opposing defenders. Sophie Cunningham has become a controversial figure because of her outspoken views away from basketball. And now Carrington has become the latest name connected to another heated moment. That's an enormous amount of attention for one franchise. But there is something important that can easily get lost in all of this. The WNBA cannot allow social media to determine its disciplinary system. Fans will always have opinions. Players will always have supporters. Commentators will always choose sides. But the league needs rules that remain consistent even when the internet is furious. That's the real test. Because if the league punishes one player heavily for dangerous contact and then handles a similar situation differently later, people will notice. And once fans start believing that discipline depends on who is involved, credibility becomes difficult to recover. This is why the Carrington incident has become such a major talking point. The actual foul lasted only a few seconds. The argument surrounding it could last for weeks. And the social media reaction has already created another layer of controversy. Carrington's white privilege post became a subject of debate almost immediately. Some interpreted it as a statement about how the incident was being perceived through race. Others believed it was an unnecessary response to a foul that had already resulted in her ejection. But there is another possibility worth considering. What if the post wasn't meant to explain the foul at all? What if Carrington was reacting to the broader online environment surrounding the Fever, Cunningham, and herself? That distinction matters. Because without hearing the complete context directly from Carrington, viewers should be careful about presenting one interpretation as absolute fact. The same principle applies to the question of intent. A dangerous foul does not automatically prove an intention to injure. a player can make a reckless decision without deliberately trying to hurt someone. That's why the strongest argument isn't necessarily Carrington wanted to injure Cunningham. The stronger argument is the contact was dangerous, it was judged serious enough for a flagrant 2 ejection, and the league now has to decide whether further discipline is warranted. That argument doesn't require guessing what was happening inside a player's mind. It focuses on what can actually be evaluated. And that is where the WNBA has an opportunity. Instead of allowing this controversy to become another endless fight between fan bases, the league can use it to clarify its standard. What constitutes excessive contact? How should repeat incidents be handled? When does aggressive defense become reckless? And how should players conduct themselves publicly after controversial moments? Those are productive questions. The internet will probably continue arguing about race. It will continue arguing about Caitlin Clark. It will continue arguing about Sophie Cunningham. And it will definitely continue arguing about DiJonai Carrington. But the league has a responsibility beyond social media arguments. It has to protect the integrity of the competition. And that brings us back to Caitlin Clark. Clark's influence on the WNBA has created opportunities that few players in the history of the league have been able to create. Her games attract enormous attention. Her jerseys sell. Her highlights dominate social media. And people who rarely watched women's basketball are now following the league. That's a tremendous opportunity. But there's a downside. Every controversial moment involving Clark or the Fever receives significantly more attention than it might have received before. The league can't control that. What it can control is how it responds. And that's why LeBron James remains an interesting part of this story. LeBron doesn't need to personally attack Carrington for his presence to matter. His public support for Clark has already made him one of the biggest names associated with her rise. When a superstar athlete publicly supports another athlete, fans pay attention. When that athlete is connected to the biggest story in women's basketball, the attention becomes even greater. So if LeBron comments on the controversy, it could send the story into another level of mainstream sports coverage. But even without a statement, his connection to Clark illustrates just how much the Fever's story has expanded. This isn't just a WNBA rivalry anymore. It's part of the larger sports conversation. And that creates an interesting challenge for everyone involved. Carrington has to deal with the consequences of the foul and the reaction to her social media post. Cunningham has to continue playing while being one of the league's most discussed personalities. Clark has to deal with the constant attention that follows her every game. The Fever have to manage the pressure surrounding their players. And the WNBA has to maintain a consistent standard while its audience continues to grow. That's a difficult balancing act. But it is also the kind of problem successful leagues eventually face. More attention means more scrutiny. More scrutiny means more criticism. And more criticism means every decision matters. So what should happen next? The answer shouldn't be based on whether someone is a Clark supporter, a Cunningham supporter, a Carrington supporter, or a critic of the Fever. It should be based on the play itself, the league's rules, and whether the punishment is consistent with previous cases. That's the standard fans should demand. Not favoritism. Not revenge. Not social media justice. Consistency. Because if the WNBA wants to convince viewers that player safety is a priority, then the rules have to be clear. And if the league believes the foul was adequately punished with the ejection, it should explain why. Transparency would go a long way. The same goes for the players. Athletes are allowed to be emotional. They're allowed to disagree. They're allowed to defend themselves. But once a controversial moment becomes public, every word can become part of the story. That's especially true when social media is involved. One sentence can create an entirely new controversy. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. A few seconds of basketball contact became a debate about race. A debate about race became a debate about Caitlin Clark. That debate brought the Indiana Fever into the center. And then LeBron James became part of the wider conversation because of his connection to Clark. That's how quickly modern sports stories evolve. The original play can be almost forgotten while the reaction becomes the real headline. But perhaps the most revealing part of this entire situation is Sophie Cunningham's response. Regardless of what anyone thinks about her opinions, she didn't need to turn the moment into a never-ending public battle. She got up. She reacted. She continued playing. And afterward, she essentially suggested that Carrington could deal with whatever frustration she had. That doesn't settle the controversy. But it does show something important. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't another viral post. Sometimes it's simply getting back to the game. And that's exactly what the Indiana Fever did. They kept playing. They dealt with the hostile atmosphere. And they finished the night with the win. That may ultimately be the most important part of the story. Because despite the foul, despite the ejection, despite the social media controversy, and despite everything being said online, the Fever still had a basketball game to finish. And they did. Now the attention turns toward what happens when these teams meet again. Will the next matchup be even more physical? Will officials be watching more closely? Will players avoid further confrontation? Or will the controversy simply create another chapter in one of the WNBA's most intense storylines? Nobody knows yet. But one thing is certain. The next meeting will be watched differently. Every defensive play involving Cunningham and Carrington will receive extra attention. Every hard collision will be replayed. Every reaction will be analyzed. And every decision by the officials will be questioned. That's the reality created by this controversy. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson here. The WNBA doesn't need more outrage. It needs clarity. Players need to know where the line is. Officials need to enforce that line consistently. The league needs to explain its decisions. And fans need to remember that not every controversial basketball play proves a larger conspiracy. The Carrington-Cunningham incident can be serious without becoming a reason to attack an entire group of people. It can raise legitimate questions about physicality without requiring assumptions about someone's motives. And it can create a conversation about accountability without turning every disagreement into a war. That's where the real story ends. Not with a social media post. Not with a viral clip. Not with a celebrity choosing a side. But with one simple question. What standard does the WNBA want to set going forward? Because Caitlin Clark isn't going away. The Indiana Fever aren't going away. Sophie Cunningham isn't going away. And DiJonai Carrington isn't going away either. The league will have to find a way for all of them to compete under the same rules. And if the WNBA gets that part right, this controversy could eventually become just another chapter in a rapidly growing league. But if the standard changes depending on who is involved, the debate will continue. And the next hard foul could create an even bigger storm. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think DiJonai Carrington's foul on Sophie Cunningham deserved more than a flagrant 2 ejection, or was the punishment already enough? And what about the white privilege post that followed? Was it a legitimate statement about the online reaction surrounding the Indiana Fever, or did it unnecessarily turn a basketball incident into a race debate? And perhaps the biggest question of all, should the WNBA be doing more to create a consistent standard for physical play? Because Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, and the Indiana Fever are going to keep attracting massive attention, and every controversial moment is going to be analyzed from every possible angle. So don't just watch the conversation, join it. Drop your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And share this video with someone who follows the WNBA. Because this story is far from over.